Today, co-founder Think Less,
Yep.
but the journey there probably not the easiest to run in your own studio, right? How did you get into filmmaking?
Yeah. I really started when my family moved to Park City, and I was just inspired by ski films, pretty much. Like, my dad was a big Warren Miller kind of guy, and I would just
Classic.
sit there with them, and we would just watch epic skiing with epic music. And a lot of my friends growing up, they were professional skiers, and I was never going to be one. So when that happens, you usually are the one with the camera. And yeah, one day I was just like, I want to make a ski film. And I went to my dad. I was like, how do I do that? And he was like, well, you need a camera, and then you edit it, and then you put music to it, and this and that. And he had this little handy cam. So I took it out, filmed my friends for the day. He was like, I have Windows Movie Maker on my laptop, and he was like, I have no idea how to use it, but like, here you go. And I just stayed up all night and made this film that was really bad, but I loved it, and it was a blast. Um, and I just kept doing it. Like, I kept making ski films, and then that was when I was probably like 14 to 16, and I would just always talk about it. And having Sundance a Film Festival up in Park City, it's like you meet a lot of different people that are in film.
Yeah.
And so I met this guy named Smitty Smith, but he just goes by Smitty. And I was talking about my ski films and whatnot, not knowing who he was. And I showed it to him. And he was like, well, if you ever want an internship, I run like a trailer house out in LA. And I was like, I don't really know what an internship is, but talked to my parents and looked up his company and found out that his business, like at the time, they were cutting the movie trailers for Avatar and Silver Linings Playbook and all these things. So it was like actually something of substance.
Yeah.
Um, and I decided to do the summer internship with him, focused on editing. So that was like the first, I think, step to actually go into the industry, while some of the other stuff was the catalyst. And there's
What
a
do
lot more rambling and other things that happen along the
you
way, but yeah.
What do you learn in a trailer house about filmmaking? Like I feel like
Yeah.
it's such a wild and like unique art form in itself, right? Like how do you take a 3 hour film like Avatar and turn it into 90 seconds that's going to play in a theater and is going to drive all the revenue for that film?
Yeah.
Like it must be a fascinating place to learn about like editing and pacing and structure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going like, since I was 16 going into it, I was super naive to any of that. Like, I wasn't asking myself those questions, but when I got there, I kind of had carte blanche to work on what I want and touch what I want and experiment and explore. And I think my favorite thing was, they would just say, hey, like, here's all the films we're working on. And I would watch them. And then the one that I resonated with the most, I would then try to cut a movie trailer or a TV spot to it. And it was a cool process because it's like, it went from an internship to a full-time job. Um, and through that experience, I realized that, as an editor in this case, like, we're getting very early cuts of the film. There were like two pretty formative films that I felt like I had a great opportunity to work on. One was it was either the first or the second Despicable Me. And we're just getting the animatics in. Like, I mean, literally just like sketches and drawings. And then you get to, as you're getting in the new versions of the film, because usually they're cutting the marketing assets as the film is being made, etc. And you just get to see this film come to life through all these different versions. And then it's a huge challenge to try to figure out, like, how can you condense, like you said, this, feature film narrative into like 2.5 minutes or 60 seconds or 30 seconds. And I think me just trying to be a sponge and asking a lot of the other season editors questions and showing them stuff and just saying like, what do you think? Or I'd watch their work and I'd be like, oh, how did you do that? You know, or like, what's your thought process behind that? And just taking all that in and then trying to apply it to what I was doing, but not trying to lose like the essence of the feeling. Because like I said, like when I would watch a film, I would I could make something better when I felt an emotional connection to it. Um, and then the second one was like Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, which I felt like I was getting hazed on that one because they're like we're releasing the film, or they had a release date, they're shooting it, we're making the marketing assets, and they gave me the script and all the dailies of their shoot, and I like build the first cut of the film with that. And that was a crazy process, but that was the process. Through that, I got to see, people on set. Because usually when I'm getting a first pass at the film, like you're not seeing behind the scenes, but this time I'm getting to see, like the the AD call action and the director stepping in and like all the crew. And I was like, whoa, this is so cool. Like, I kind of want to do that. And then so after being hazed and not really enjoying that experience, I did realize like I want to move away from editing and step into directing, which I was like probably 19 then. So still naive, being like, I'm going to go direct now. So, yeah.
And so where did you go?
So I left LA because I did kind of get my ass kicked out there being like a teenager. And
Yeah, 16 to 18. That's
yeah,
a tough time to
yeah,
jump into a place you're not from.
yeah, not at all. And I was kind of like living these dual lives where I had friends that were in college and coworkers, and it got to the point where, you know, I would go see my friends on campus, and then other people would be like, hey, like, you want to meet up with me in the library to study? I'm like, I don't go to your school. So I left LA, was like, I'm going to go direct. And like around that same time, a mutual friend reached out to me and was like, hey, I'm doing like YouTube videos and stuff. And I was like, all right, I mean, it seems kind of interesting. And then he sent me some of the films, and he was getting at the time like, you know, tens of millions of views. And this was all like the Devon Supertramp era and Fruit Ninja and all these weird little things. And I dabbled in that world for a little bit, and I was like, I don't really like this because for me personally, I'm a feelings guy. I wasn't feeling a lot with it. And then I got a call from like a family friend who was in the automotive industry. And out of the blue, he's like, yeah, I just bought like this Red Epic camera. Do you know how to use it? And I was like, yeah, I mean, I've used them before. And he was like, do you want to come over and build it for me and show me how it works? And I went over and built it for him. And then he was like, do you want a job? And I was like, sure, I need a job right now. I'll take a job. And then I started doing automotive work for a hot second. I'm telling you this stuff because it's like, I did a lot of like weird different things, and each one of those things helped me figure out what I actually want to do with directing. And I think looking back in the moment, I didn't quite understand. I think I was feeling frustrated because I'm kind of like, oh, I'm jumping from movie trailers to like viral marketing to, to now automotive. And it can be frustrating, but now looking back, I'm like, oh man, all those things were so formative because each one of those experiences ultimately led me to a place where I'm like, I need to figure out my voice as a filmmaker and what ultimately I want to do with films. So,
And so what was that process? Because I think a lot of filmmakers have similar journeys,
yeah.
right? Like, I was a broadcast journalist for 10 years, and like my job was I had to make 2 to 3 news stories a day. So you're running around like crazy, and you're like You do an interview and then you film a thing and then you do an interview and then you start to go like, I don't think I like this very much. And,
Yeah.
news got super depressing. And so it was like, got tired of covering accidents and court and,
Yeah.
things that similar to you, like things that I didn't care about. Like they
Yeah.
didn't move me at all. And I was like making news that I was like, this isn't what I want my community to be known for. These aren't the stories that I
Yeah.
think are important. So I think having those experiences is really foundational. But so what was the step that you took or the steps to start finding your voice and making things that you did care about?
Yeah. I mean, I think at that point, I thought back to this short film that I made in high school about a friend of mine who lost his father in the 9/11 attacks. And we did a screening at Park City High School, and we watched it, and I remember the credits rolling and no applause. And I was like, oh, okay, this is incredibly embarrassing. Like, I guess no one liked this film. And then I stepped out of the theater, and then I was watching people come out, and they didn't applaud because they were in tears and they were moved by it. And then it was a cathartic experience for the people that are a part of it. And I saw that like film is a really cool way to elicit emotions, where a lot of times I think it's easy for us to walk around with a lot of walls or blockage or this and that. And, it's the arts in general, film, music, like all those things help you tap into that. And so I thought back to that experience, and I'm like, I love documentaries. Um, I love real stories. I like being able to show the humanity in people and these universal themes. And at that point, I was like, okay, I know that's what I want to do. And a lot of things in life are just kind of like serendipitous, because then I met um, my business partner, Phil, and we were at a time, I think like 23 or 24. And Phil was coming off of making this feature doc about his adopted brother, Brolin, who's trying to become Uganda's first snowboarder in the Olympic Games. And they made that film, and then we started talking, and we were like, man, there's probably a lot of other stories out there like that. So then we developed this series called Far From Home, which told the story of these unlikely winter athletes and their quest to make it to the Olympic Games. And we got the opportunity to meet with two production companies. One was Mandalay Sports, and the other was Boardwalk Pictures. And the founding team at Boardwalk, they really loved the concept, and they actually knew someone that just started or was part of the team that was starting up the Olympic Channel. And so they took this documentary series project, and then they greenlit it. And that was like the first big project that I got to do, and I was totally out of my element, like totally. But they were great, because they kind of gave us the keys to the car and said, don't crash it. Like, they were pretty hands off, and it was a super healthy budget and a ton of content and these 30-minute documentaries. And because we got that opportunity, it allowed me to continue exploring even more, like, what is my voice in filmmaking. And through meeting all these different athletes, characters in the film, I got to just learn about like what motivates them and why do they do what they do. And then I think a lot of times when we are just meeting new people, we kind of see these mirror images, and that's when like you're really connecting with someone. And through that, I got to discover, like, okay, here are the themes that really resonate with me. And then it kind of clicked, where I'm like, I don't necessarily, although I do a lot of sports filmmaking, and that is definitely its own genre, I like to think of myself as like a thematic director, where I really gravitate towards stories of like triumph over adversity, or father-son dynamics, or stories of love. And yeah, I think it was those experiences that just continue to help me figure out like who is the Cole as a filmmaker ultimately.
As you were navigating that project, because I mean, that's, you know, if there's an example of jumping into the deep end, without a parachute, for lack of a better one, uh, what are you starting to look at in terms of like story structure, and how do you put these together, and how do you make people care and engage across 30 minutes?
Yeah, yeah, the process is like a lot of times it can be very analytical for me, and then it's also like we talked about, like very feeling based. And what I learned that works for me is when I'm approaching the films that I'm making, I almost am trying to think of it as if I was going to approach a narrative film to some degree. And it's not exactly like plug and play, but, pre-interviews, of course, like talking to these people, approaching it like first and foremost as them as human beings, So I'd hop on the phone with them and I'm just like, it's almost a big therapy session where I'm like, let's talk about your life. And like, and I share parts of my life and we're bonding and connecting over that. And then, in this case for that series, it was like they're trying to make it to the Winter Olympic Games. And to do that, they need to qualify at qualifying events. So that's like the active journey storyline. And then through that, it's like, what are the deeper character rooted things that they're battling, you know? And you learn that through conversation with them. And so from there, it's like, I would just do like a beat sheet and just kind of map out what I think the story can be. And then I go out and make it. And a lot of times when I'm shooting it or when we're shooting it, it doesn't turn out that way. But like the intention is there. And I put a lot of emphasis into the prep for it. And I think probably then I overcompensated with that for my lack of onset experience. Whereas now I think I'm definitely more comfortable with like the type of prep that I do. Um, but yeah.
And so, what does your process look like now? Like, how has it evolved since that first, big series? Like, what are some of the projects you've taken on, and how have you sort of refined your voice as you've been telling
Yeah.
more?
Yeah. Man, that's a good question. I mean, I think I'm still approaching it from like a very human to human level always. I think nowadays I'm trying to understand like what is like how can I tell this story in a fresh way or something that is nonlinear? Can I be bouncing between different storylines, or how do you interweave multiple characters? I did this feature doc called World Debut, which was like the follow-up of the docu-series, which told the story of how skateboarding, sport climbing, and surfing got into the Olympic Games. And that was a huge challenge because it's all these like isolated, stories.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, they got into the Olympics, but it's like there's the champions that got the sport in. It's like they had no real connection to each other. So being able to understand like how can you throw from one beat of the story to the next in a seamless way? How can there be multiple integrated storylines with it? And I think a lot of that is just, to be honest, like me leaning on good teams, like, leaning into mentors. A lot of the same stuff I was doing at the Trailer House Company, where it's like, how would you approach this? Or you want to watch this and let me know what you think? And then having just like great editors too, because that is one thing I'm really grateful for through my experience with editing, is I am able to a lot of times like visualize the story and be cutting it while I'm shooting it or even beforehand. And also I just love like getting the editor in as early as freaking possible to save me from the countless footage that exists. And yeah, I think like nowadays trying to figure out like voice as a filmmaker Um, I think, I think it just kind of changes as you get older and your priorities change. Like, I'm 31 now, and I think about family and a lot of different things that I was not thinking about in my early 20s. And then I think my appetite and my interests just change. And that's an interesting thing too, because it's like kind of makes you pause and ask, okay, what type of stories do I want to be sharing now and exploring now? Which a lot of times it's like a good kind of reset, because I think it's easy as creatives to get into ruts and feeling a little bit like you're in still water sometimes. So, yeah.
So the series you did with Boardwalk Pictures, that's, original idea, original
Mm-hmm.
concept,
Mm-hmm.
going through kind of the traditional industry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what about on the brand side? Like, I know you
Yeah.
guys have a project here
Yep.
with the North Face, um, but how do you navigate storytelling inside of a brand framework?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not a one size fits all, and totally comes down to the appetite of the brand, and also it's just like climate of the world as well, because there's been times where brands have been like, I don't really care, like it's an awesome story, go and make it. And there's times like nowadays where brands are a little bit like under the gun and having to be very very fiscally conservative, and they're like, there needs to be clear objectives with this. um, Ideally, there's always a good champion of a story that works at the brand. Ultimately a brand is hiring me and a team. And I think when I was younger, I would always look at it as like, oh, nice, like this is an opportunity to make a cool film. And now that have more experience, it's actually, I realize there's much more responsibility with that, where it's like, yeah, there's a service that I ultimately need to bring to the table. And I understand that they want something at the end of the day that's going to be entertaining first. So I think the big thing is just trying to upfront like identify what does success look like. What would what would make your team happy? What would make your stakeholders happy? Is this more for like employee retention? Is this to launch a new product? Is this to just have a voice in the space? And I think a lot of the times, like, you know, brands might not even know that to a degree. So it's almost like you have to learn each other's language. And I always look at it as like an educational opportunity for both sides, because it's like, I need to know about your brand, and I'm assuming, you might not know a lot about the filmmaking process, and we're here to teach and work together with, the big goal, which is to make something that fulfills whatever objective you're trying to do. So, and then a lot of the times as well, it is trying to remind them that, to get people to watch, there needs to be a compelling story to this. It needs to be some type of, you know, central narrative and characters and a journey that ultimately the audience is going to go on. And especially nowadays when there's like so much stuff to watch, like there's so many options. You have to ask yourself, like, what's going to make someone sit down and not watch, a 15-second Instagram or a TikTok and put on your, maybe 3 to 12-minute film. And with the series that we worked on, that was kind of like a hybrid of almost all the experiences and the space that we've had to date, because that started with our relationship with the Sport Climbing Federation, just saying like, hey, what would the access look like if we were to do this embed style format? And they were like, yeah, we could give, we liked our experience working with you guys on the feature doc world debut. We would definitely be open to giving you access. And then so they had an event in Salt Lake. We did like a little, we shot some tape essentially. And it was kind of this like testing ground for both of us because they've never had cameras behind the climbing wall, the isolation zone. Like there's no phones, no cameras, no nothing. So it's a big shift for athletes. So it's kind of like, getting our feet wet, making sure everyone's cool with it. That worked really well. Then we were like, hey, we think this could be something. What do you think about putting in, 20 grand and we can go to the world championship and we can shoot it, cut a sizzle and try to, pre-sell it to a network. And they would essentially recoup their costs based on the sale of the project. And they were into it, cut the sizzle, brought on Little Monsters, which is Chai and Jimmy Chen's production company. And then it was like, okay, we need more money now. Because we're up against a timeline. Like this is an active competition circuit. And so that's when, Phil had his relationship with the North Face, and it was just like an instant connection because the North Face is like the backbone or one of the backbones of the sport of climbing. And they just want to promote the hell out of climbing in general. And they were fantastic. Like it's rare to get really great partners like that are just like, yes, we want it. Little Monsters and the team is behind it. It's like all the right ingredients for it. So then they ultimately came on board and allowed us to keep making the thing, which was great, obviously.
As you're navigating these projects and you're sort of navigating this world of the brand funded films, how is your voice continuing to evolve, and like what advice would you have to filmmakers thinking about getting into this space and going like, how do I navigate the things I want to say in the world of what
Yeah.
brands want?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of times I'm like, I don't know if this is the right way to think about it, but this is the way I think about it. It's almost like a Trojan horse of an idea. You have to be able to have a story that you feel really connected to. And then you have to, I think as a filmmaker, and for me, I have to figure out how can I make this idea sexy enough and fit well enough for a brand, because I can't just go in and say like, hey, this is a great story, I want to tell it. Like it's very self-serving. It has to be this mutual thing. So I think a lot of the times it's like researching brands and seeing what is their voice in this space. What are they talking about? Do they have an in-house team or do they hire everything out? And trying to like do a lot of investigating and figure out like what's the best way I can, package it ultimately and get someone to tell the story that I feel really passionate and connected about. And it's like, it's a lot of no's. It's just a lot of no's, but I think you kind of build up some stamina and you try to have skin like Teflon and just let things kind of slide off a little bit. And you just kind of keep knocking and going, and you want to find someone that believes in it. And I think when you speak to a brand and, whoever's in there, like you also need to tell them the story, because if I'm just like explaining to you what A, B, and C happens, it can be kind of boring. So it's like I'd like to go in and say like, yeah, just tell a story with it. This is my connection to it. This is, my experience with your brand. And this is why the story feels like it connects to the brand and what you guys are talking about. And, and other people aren't talking about this. And I think in addition to that, also bringing to light ideas for distribution, because what was the saying? It was like, it was something along the lines of like, story is king and it's like story is king and distribution is God or something like that along those lines. But nowadays it really is, everyone's asking like, we make it and how do we get it out there? Because it's not like you can make it and people are just going to come anymore. So we always try to go in with that type of perspective. And like, I'm working on a new project with Ford Motor Company right now. And And that's a lot of what we talked about with this new film that we're doing for them. And there's a lot of ways to like cut it up, but it's definitely been an interesting challenge because the further I get into my career, the more I'm talking about the business side of it and the distribution, and I notice that less of the story comes up. So I have to be aware and like remind myself like this is still a big component of it. And I think just with time, like you get better at kind of bouncing back and forth between those things. And at first, when I was doing it, I was terrible at doing it. It was super sloppy, and I was, sometimes walking around with like my chest puffed out and being like, "No, it's all about the story, and it has to be." But that can only get you so far. When at the end of the day, it's like art and commerce, and if it is for a brand, it's like, you know, at some point you're gonna relinquish control of it, unless you win the lotto and you're just making your own stuff. We joke, we're like, we should just build an app and sell it and then just make the films we want. But
When you look at that dynamic and like you're right, it's the critically important, it's the magic piece of the puzzle that I think everyone's trying to solve.
yeah,
But at the core of it, there's this story of a real person who really exists in the world. I think that's what's interesting about so much of this brand storytelling work is so much of it's documentary. What do you view your role and your responsibility to that person whose story you're telling?
yeah, I mean, I don't take it lightly at all. I always looked at it as, you know, I have a mic and I'm passing it to them. Um, and I'll listen to Sarah's advice and bring some ego into this a little bit. But I did a whole entire TEDx talk about this, um, which was around kind of like the power of storytelling. And I think some of the greatest people we have in the world, were once people we've never heard of. And their story was shared. And a lot of times it's someone, whether it's like a photographer taking a picture or a journalist interviewing someone or a documentary filmmaker making a film on it. It's all about like building this, setting this stage for them to share their story. And I just have tools. Like I know tools, I have tools to help get their point of view across. And I think when you do it in that way, it also builds a lot of trust. Because I think the only way that we can have people share their stories is creating a safe space where they feel like they can be vulnerable ultimately. People can tell if like you're coming in and it feels transactional. And like a lot of the stories I have told, I've had, the like individuals tell me like, wow, it's so nice having you guys here because we just had like a news team come in and they came in for a day or two and it was like boom, 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 boom. And, I get it. Like that's the style. But with doc work, it's so much more about honoring someone's voice and their perspective and working together because they're going to have hesitations. Like I've made films where halfway through or at the end, they're like, I don't like this anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to tell my story. And then sometimes you have to give it space and let people, digest how they're feeling emotionally. Because it is a very emotional process having someone kind of bare their heart and their perspective. And nowadays where it's like sometimes you can be berated and like shamed for having a point of view on certain things, which is a shame because I think I'm about to say perspectives tie it in, but it's like, it's important that we all have different perspectives and it paints and colors the shared humanity that we all have because it isn't black and white. Like people have different viewpoints and some are complex and some are ugly and some are beautiful. And I think, it is a really difficult challenge getting brands to be okay with that. It is. But I think if brands ultimately want to get their work onto streaming platforms or big audiences, they need to be 100% okay with showing, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if they're not okay with that, then it's looking at like what are the different options that can still fit into that mold. And sometimes, like, if a brand isn't okay with telling a good story, then sometimes it's assessing and being like, okay, are we the right people to do this? And don't get me wrong, like I still get work where it's like sometimes the story isn't that great, but it's like if it's a story that I care about and I see the value in it, then I'm going to work really hard with the brand to also figure out like how we can bring it together in a way that still honors it. And I think if brands are going to tell human stories too, it's important that they have a good understanding of, you know, like, yeah, this is another person and their story and their life. And there's like, it's not just the filmmaker's responsibility, it's the responsibility of the people that are also funding it too. So
Amazing. Before I let you go,
yeah.
I've got my, I'm now going to call them 5 thoughtful questions
Okay.
because they're not as rapid as I
Hit me.
had once planned. What's a story that had a big impact on your life and why?
Oh man, that is a tough question. I mean, there's definitely films that have. Are we talking films or
It
just
could be it could be
anything?
anything. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first film that I remember making a huge impact on my life was Slumdog Millionaire. And I think I I mean, just what I loved about it was this like coming of age love story, and sometimes not feeling like, yeah, not feeling seen and heard, but there's like one person in the world that does see and hear you, and you'll travel great lengths to see them again, or have that type of connection. And I don't know, there's like something from my childhood where that just really resonated with me. um, I guess a personal story was like, I think I've always just been kind of a romantic type, but I remember I was probably 11 years old, and I was at the pool in our neighborhood, and there was this girl there who was my babysitter, much older than me, and I always wanted to like just talk to her outside of just the babysitting realm. Um, and I never had the courage to. And I thought that day I was at the pool I was going to, and then she left, and I was kind of down in the dumps, dogging on myself. And then I hopped on my bike, and then I was riding away from the pool, and I saw her walking down this hill. And I'm like, what better opportunity? I can impress her now. And so I'm pedaling my bike, going super fast, starting to go down this hill. I'm like, I'm going to stand on the seat of my bike, and that's going to get her attention. And I'm starting to get up on my seat, and then I'm getting speed wobble. And then before I know it, I just completely bail, road rash all over me. I'm bawling my eyes out. And then she runs over, and she's like, oh my God, are you okay? And then she's like, let me walk you home and we'll take care of this. And it worked out in the end because I got to walk home with her. But I think the reason that story resonates because it's like, I don't know, you're just following these gut feelings and taking these weird little chances, and sometimes it doesn't, you don't, it's not working out how you plan, but ultimately it does work out. And I try to like think back to those childhood stories a lot nowadays because I don't want to lose like the childlike wonder and the essence and just kind of that like big imagination that you have when you're a kid and you're just going for things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it. You sort of answered this one.
Yeah.
But what's one film you think everyone should watch?
Slumdog Millionaire is one of them. I think like American History X, and I know you said one film, but I'm gonna just rattle off films that really resonate with me. Interstellar is another one. I love that film. Searching for Sugar Man is a great documentary. Jojo Rabbit is another favorite. And they're just all films that like thematically resonate with me. Like I would spend time watching films and then figure out like what theme, like why do I like these themes?
Yeah.
And I think all of it is where it's like, yeah, it's just great characters who are complex, who are kind of having their perception of the world a little bit shattered or completely shattered and having to rebuild again. And I resonates with me because I feel like throughout life, like we are just constantly going to do that. So
Yeah.
those films.
What's something you never leave home without?
Besides my phone.
Yeah, I know, right?
I mean, it's lame to say, but yeah, I mean, it's my phone, and not to talk or call to people, but for music ultimately. Like I'm just always listening to music, probably an unhealthy amount to some degree, but yeah.
Awesome. What's an important place for you to go to find inspiration?
I mean, I think it totally depends. I mean, there's sometimes where, and it's cliche, but just getting outside in nature, like paddleboarding with my dog or going on a hike or like a solo mission somewhere to kind of disconnect from like the clutter of everything. Or sometimes I just need like a random adventure somewhere. Like I'm fortunate enough to be traveling for my line of work, and also I just love travel in general, so I do my own trips and whatnot. But like I was earlier this year, I went to Dublin just by myself, and I loved it because I didn't know a single person, and I would just listen for live music, and I would go into one pub, have a couple beers, meet a bunch of random people, have great conversation, listen to music, go out back outside, try to listen for where the next pub is that's playing live music, and just kind of rinse and repeat. And I found myself at one point, like one of the days, just sitting in the park on a park bench and talking to like an old Irish man. And, it's just like having these little seeming, at times that seem completely meaningless interactions, but they're actually like really refreshing because you're just experiencing life and like I know I just said to take my phone everywhere, but it's like getting away from my phone and getting away from the computer and getting away from those things and like really just living life. Which I'll tell you this quick story, and you can tell me to shut up if you want because I'm rambling, but it's like, another story that really resonated with me was, in my early 20s when I hopped in like a random Uber with a driver, and we were like in this for an hour because we're in LA and it's just constantly gridlock. And we just started chatting about his life and him immigrating to America and family and all these different things. And by the end, I looked at him and I'm like, oh my God, that was just, I'm in my early 20s. I'm like, that was amazing. And he's like, you want to know why it was amazing? And I said, why? And he's like, mirror images. It's because you see yourself in me and I see me in you. And that definitely has always stuck with me 100% because that really, I mean, we talked about it earlier on. It's like that's the connection piece. So, yeah.
What's the most important skill for a storyteller to develop?
Yeah, being able to just talk to people. Like a good exercise, I think, is whether it's in your town or you're in a random city, just starting conversation with people, and listening. What's that? There's like a saying where it's like God gave us one mouth and two ears, so we, could talk less and listen more. And I think that's my approach for a lot of the work that I do, where I really am just asking a lot of questions and trying to understand someone's perspective and all their experiences that shaped them and their outlook and who they are. And, I feel like that's applicable for whether, you're doing branded documentary storytelling or original documentary storytelling or narrative films. Like, it's all just people and their experiences that have shaped them. And you can listen to people to get perspective on it. And then you need to look at your own life and your own story and listen to yourself and get perspective on who you are. And then you can really start telling powerful stories then too. So,
Amazing.
yeah.
Thanks so much, Cole.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.